what on earth do parents need to know about children and money?
I think there are some perceptions that maybe get in the way of us teaching our kids about money. And the other thing is sometimes we feel like there's a specific age that we can begin. It's never too soon to begin those conversations.
We're excited, Cass, to talk about how to talk about money to your kids. Because I feel like, we all now as adults or young adults or old adults, all the spectrums of adulthood I think we understand that we're not doing a good job of educating our society on how to utilize money.
We definitely have some opportunities, I think.
Yeah.
I think there are some people, especially as I interact with families and get to play financial games with them, I see some families are really, really moving forward and they're doing an amazing job. I have 3-year-olds come up and they can point out a penny, a nickel, a dime, a quarter. And then I have other families where they're like, we don't know. The kiddos aren't quite sure. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but there's definitely an opportunity for us as parents to get more involved, especially as we, dive into some of the psychological things and really help our kids understand why they want to spend this money or why they get upset when you have to tell them no.
Okay. Well, Cass, tell us a little bit before we dive into all of that, what it is that you do for Mountain America and why we're talking about this topic today.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a financial educator, and I actually have a background. I have a background in social work, and then I kind of made a move into education. So first a bachelor's of social work, like I said, and then the master's of education, specifically in instructional design and educational technology. But there's absolutely some psychological pieces of that as well. And so it's been a fun ride for sure. This is the job of my dreams. I couldn't ask for anything better.
I love that. So speaking of kind of that psychological piece of it, why, I guess my question is, what on earth do parents need to know about children and money and how they work together? What are your thoughts on that?
So understanding the two, I think there are some perceptions that maybe get in the way of us teaching our kids about money. Things like, well, I don't want to worry them, especially if you have a stressful financial situation. You might feel like you don't want to put that burden on their shoulders. You might also feel like it's none of their business. I've also heard people say, well, they're going to learn it in school. And so some of these perceptions that we have about our kids and money can kind of get in the way of us teaching our kids how to get started. And the other thing is sometimes we feel like there's a specific age that we can begin, maybe when they're 8 or when they're 11 or, wait until they get their first job. And in my opinion, that is way too late to begin talking about money. We can begin talking to our kids about money as soon as they're, 2 and 3. We were talking earlier about pointing out the coins and teaching them the words. And I had that yesterday with a kiddo who, could barely talk. And we were saying, let's try penny, and holding it up. It's never too soon to begin those conversations. And I think it's just managing the information that you're giving them to make sure that it doesn't overwhelm them or feel like it's that it doesn't make sense. Start small.
Okay. I love that. Well, and I've heard you talk about money scripts before too.
Yeah.
So tell us more about those and how those apply to our kids.
Definitely. And I think we alluded to this last time we talked, right? So our money scripts are often inherited from the people who care for us. So whether that's a parent, grandparent, aunt, uncle, somebody who's not necessarily biologically related to us, but there's that familial relationship. That's where we get our money scripts from, between that and then our experiences, of course. And so what's important for us as parents to be aware of what those are, because they're going to be passed on to our kids. And sometimes just having that time to kind of step back and reflect on what you believe and where it came from. And sometimes even going as far as trying to test whether or not that belief is true can be really powerful for you as a parent, because maybe there's something you picked up on along the way that you've always understood to be true. And maybe you found out that it wasn't necessarily true, or maybe, with a few changes, it may be something, if it was something that was perceived as negative in the past, maybe now it's perceived as positive because of these changes that you made. And now you have that knowledge that you can pass on to your children.
Yeah, I love that. Can you give us some examples of money scripts that, you're talking about?
Absolutely. One that always comes to mind is credit cards are bad. And I remember growing up, my parents weren't, sorry, Dad, my parents weren't particularly, they weren't necessarily afraid of using credit. But I remember one time my dad telling me about how he used his credit cards. And I believed that that was the right way because I hadn't heard anything different. And then I remember in college, somebody said, well, why don't you use your credit card like this? Use it, pay it off, use it, pay it off. And I was like, what? This is all new to me. I can do that and it will still build my credit, right? And so that was kind of an exciting moment for me. And then, just kind of into my adulthood, even still some of the interactions with my parents. My dad's a big Dave Ramsey fan and he doesn't like having debt and no credit cards. And I'm like, Dad, you're missing out on the rewards that you can earn on everyday purchases just by using it and paying it off.
Yeah.
And now that he knows that, I don't know if he necessarily took the advice from me, but he did begin to use his credit card that way. Now he's paying for, flights across the country.
Yeah.
With his rewards. And so that's a prime example.
No debt, right?
Yeah. And still no debt. And that's a prime example of one of those money scripts where we have the opportunity to understand where it came from. Maybe it was from experience or maybe it was from his parents. And then we can say, is there a way that maybe that's not necessarily true? And could I test that for myself to see? And then once you have that knowledge, that's what you can then pass on to your kids.
I love that. I love that.
Another thing to be aware of around money scripts is we tend to have these sayings like we can't afford that or money doesn't grow on trees. And they create these feelings of scarcity in our kids, or they can create these feelings of scarcity. And we just want to be aware of those and make sure that as we're communicating, we use things that are positive to avoid making money feel like it's scary or, creating feelings of anxiety as they grow up and start to handle money. Sometimes that we don't have enough or we can't afford that can actually lead to financial behaviors that are not really productive or could even be problematic. And so we just want to be really careful with the words that we do use. So maybe saying something instead like, we haven't budgeted for that this week. Maybe we can plan for that next time, can have a really big impact on allowing them to feel like there is enough and also understanding that there are constraints that we have to abide with in order to be successful.
Yeah. And I love that too, just in maybe our own self-talk.
Yes.
Right. And seeing those things that maybe we want, for future and being like, oh, I'm never going to be able to afford that. I don't know. Boat or that Tesla or whatever it is, right, that we have in mind. But no, we totally can afford it. It's just haven't planned for it yet.
Exactly.
I love that mentality.
Yeah.
And how important to make sure that we are just having those conversations with kids. Like, so what do you suggest? Is it something that we're like, okay, kids, tonight we're going to talk about money and just start out that way and be like, okay, who can identify these coins and what their value and what we can buy? Like, what are your thoughts? How do we go about that?
There's a couple of different ways that you can approach it. So there are what are called explicit learning experiences. That's the formal term for it in the education world. An explicit learning experience is kind of, if you think of like the things that we learn in a classroom setting, very formal and structured and planned out, sitting down and saying, okay, here are these coins and we're going to learn what the names of these are and what the values are, is a perfect example of an explicit learning experience.
Okay.
So you can set those up. And if you're ever looking for resources, you can always go on Google. There's tons of different things that you can find as far as printables and activities to help engage your kids. Even going on Amazon and buying the little plastic coins for them to play with can, and allowing them to, like, as your kids get bigger, saying, hey, what we're going to do today is you're going to pretend to make a $10 purchase and I will show you how to give change back, for example. That's an explicit learning experience. And you can see these don't have to be super structured and formal, but they are very intentional. and kind of planned out. Now, the other option is an implicit learning experience. And these are different because these are the things that kind of happen in the moment. A lot of our learning, especially when we're really young, comes from those experiences that we have. And so this could be something like going to the store and saying, hey, guys, we have a $15 budget, and seeing how they operate in that. Sometimes some of the things that I've done, my kiddo will say, hey, can I pay today? Sure. Here's my debit card. And I show them, okay, you put this in the machine. And of course, I don't give them my PIN number, but I show them like, oh, look, mom's entering her PIN number, and now we can take it out. Giving them the receipt. If they can read, letting them look over the receipt is something that they just like, what?
I love that.
I've seen with like my 8 and 10-year-old where they're just like, you spent how much? Is that a lot of money?
Yeah.
And so, again, those conversations can come up, those activities where you're not necessarily planning it out, but still allowing them to have those experiences.
Okay. I love that. What a good idea. So as we're setting up some of these learning experiences, aside from being able to like count back change, which my first job, I had to do that. And I learned a lot. I don't think I could do it to this day, but we're so used to that. I'll just pull out my calculator. Yeah. But so in addition to, kind of planning these things out and then obviously having them in the moment in those more implicit things, what other topics do we need to be talking to our kids about? Like, how do we teach them how much things are worth just by talking about it? Like, what are your thoughts that way?
I think that there's a few ways that you can approach that. Grandma and grandpa, like that's one of the situations I always think of is like grandma and grandpa give kids money for birthdays, or, maybe they earn money, which is a really good way for kids to begin to learn that value. It's easy for them to start to see this is what $10 buys, or, one of my favorite things to do right now, I'm learning the value of like human capital in terms of getting my kids to do chores. And I'm really enjoying this period of their childhood where I can say, hey guys, I need you to do the dishes, or I need you to sweep the floor. But what we will do is we'll have them do their chores that are their chores, make their bed, put their clothes away, clean their bedrooms, things like that. And then anything outside of that, perhaps it's, I need to have the kitchen floor swept, or I need you to wipe off the counters. Those are things where we'll give them some, I guess, allowance money, if you will. I don't like the term allowance, but, I do things with my kids like, hey, if you do this, I'll give you $1 kind of thing.
Yeah.
Here's a quick way to earn $1. And we all know you don't earn dollars quickly. They do have to put some work into it. But for a 7 or 9-year-old who doesn't have a lot of experience doing that, it is a job for them. And so showing them that they have to work and they have to earn in order for them to be able to go out and spend has been one of the ways that I think they've started to see that value. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, that's really, really cool. I love that. Well, and how do we, we talked about our money scripts and how we're going to, if we're not careful, maybe pass some of those negative ones on down to our kids. How do we prevent some of those perceptions or money scripts that are negative from sneaking in?
Sure. I think it's just about having open and honest conversations. So a common thing that kids perceive is that mom and dad can just put the card in and then they can pay for anything. And with my kids, I've had to say, well, hold on a second. Mom has to pay for that. And in order for us to pay for that, mom has to go to work. And so kind of creating that connection and then having them do that same thing at home by doing their chores. And I think that's one way. I think other negative perceptions that you might run into are things, like maybe they heard something from school at a friend, from a friend. And I think the way to kind of address that is to ask them questions and say, well, what do you know about this so far? Or sometimes kids will say things that are completely off the wall, especially I think right now in a period where like older kids, 12, 13 years old, they're going online and they're exposed to social media in some cases. They'll come up with things that are completely out of context and asking them, hey, where did you find this information? And tell me what you know about it so far. And then kind of seeing what they understand and creating some clarifications when needed and addressing the inaccuracies is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, we had a random example of, one of our members' sons had gotten this awesome thing on social media, right?
Yeah.
Where he's like, oh, make $5,000 quick. Yeah. And he was so excited. Turns out, of course, that's a scam.
Right.
But, to his little mind, he was like, oh, I'm so stoked. I can actually make some money.
Yeah. And sadly, that's happened to more than just one of our members. That's a common thing that kids run into. And so I think it's really important that we are carefully monitoring our kids' interactions online.
Yeah.
And because it impacts us financially. I mean, there are so many big things when you think of social media and when you think of the internet that our kids can run into.
Oh, sure.
We don't always go to potential problems with money. And so it is important for us to have that awareness and to continue to keep those lines of communication open.
Yeah, I love that. So speaking of technology, obviously we know it can certainly help us with teaching our kids about money, maybe hurt us too. But what are your thoughts on how we can better integrate technology in? Because obviously, I mean, for my 6-year-old little boy, if he's got a video game that can teach him about money, we're golden.
Yes. I love that. And there are actually a number of great resources out there. This summer, I've been keeping my kids busy at home and I've found some really cool things. So an example of one of those is called Brain Pop. It's an app where kids watch videos and then they can, complete a quiz or, there's a few other activities that go with it. But it's really neat. I overheard one of my kids listening to a video about credit and debt. And I was like, what? She's 9 years old and she's learning about these things already, understanding what interest is and what it means when you use a credit card. And I loved that. I was so excited. And then, of course, one of the things that Mountain America offers as to the community is Bonsai. So Bonsai is free for our community to use because of our partnership. And it's an amazing resource for anybody from age 7 all the way into adulthood. I love Bonsai just because of the different groups that it can reach. So if you have a 7-year-old, they can play Bonsai Junior where they learn how to run a lemonade stand and they have a goal to save up for a hoverboard or they have a goal to save up for a bicycle. For kids that are older, 13 to 17 years old, there's actually a game called Bonsai Teen and that one's cool because they're trying to figure out how to pay for their first semester of college. So they have a job and they've got to learn how to begin to budget their money. And that is the savings goal, is to pay for your first semester. And then in the Bonsai Plus game, this is, 18 and up. This is like, I for a long time was really afraid of doing the double accounting method and the, moving money into different buckets in my accounts.
Yes.
And that kind of broke me of that fear. So even grown-ups, we can still learn something, in preparation for teaching our kids. And that was something that was really neat for me. But you go in and you're learning how to do all these different things with credit and you're saving for your down payment on your house. And so it's a really neat experience. And then, of course, there's tons of articles and coaches and things like that are really beneficial for kids. In addition to Bonsai, there are lots of apps out there where kids can begin to experience what it's like to earn money and what it's like to spend money. Some apps have debit cards that go with them. And so you can set it up where your kiddo does a chore, it's assigned a specific amount for payment. And once it's complete, it takes the money and it transfers it over to them. And then they have this debit card that they can go out and spend.
Oh, that's cool.
So there's things like that. One of the things you want to be aware of with apps is just making sure that, number one, they're secure. Because a lot of these do integrate with your financial institutions. And then you also want to make sure that if you are going to pay for it, that it's adding value to what you are working on. That's one of the worst things, is having to pay for an app that doesn't really do what you need it to. So some of these, they do have free trials. Be sure to take advantage of those and really see what's working for you before you commit to just one.
Yeah, I love that.
So maybe you're not ready to jump into the apps, or, I know for me, it's just like already things are too complicated and I don't need one more thing to manage. One of the things that you could get is a Mountain America My Express debit card.
Okay.
And this is a really cool card because people are only able to put they're only able to do the transaction amount for what's available in the account. So in addition to that, and having it be something where you can assign an individual PIN number to it, it's completely free to use. And that's a really big benefit, because we were just talking about these apps where some of them are paid in order to use them. It's a good way to get out of that and be able to still see everything closely and keep your kiddos' transactions close to you so you can monitor.
Okay, so is this a debit card that I just set up on my account? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's pretty easy to set up. You can either go into a branch or you can go online. You'd log into your account and you could set up the My Express debit card that way.
Okay, interesting. And so I just give this card to my teen and say, hey, here you go. Here's your $50 or whatever is the amount on there, and that's all they can spend.
Yeah, that's as long, so they can do a transaction for what the available balance is.
Awesome.
Yep.
You know, I was even just having a conversation the other night with my kids, because I've told my daughter, you know, if she gets this, or this, because she's working on it through tumbling, like once she gets her back walkover, we're going to go pick a prize, you know? So she's earned it once she gets this. And it's funny because my 6-year-old was like, well, Mom, that's not even a need. She doesn't need that. And I'm like, you're right. She doesn't need that. You know? So then we had an awesome conversation about needs and wants, which I think was totally not planned, right? Yeah. It was one of those implicit things that just randomly came up that I have no idea why, you know, my little boy was like, she doesn't need that. Because he was totally right. But an opportunity, right? A teaching opportunity to talk about, hey, the things we need versus the things we want.
Yes.
And then how do I guess really what it comes down to, Cass, in teaching my kids about money, I just need to start this whole family economy thing, right?
You could.
Okay.
You could absolutely, like I said, it's making me really happy because there are fewer things that I have to do around my house.
Yeah, the kids are helping you. And I swear my parents were in on this. Like they had so many kids so that they could do all the chores. Is that right, Mom and Dad? Like, I swear that's what the plan was. But
maybe. You know, the other thing that that I recall from my childhood that I've passed on is having my kids earn money for their grades.
Oh,
and
okay.
Every grading system is structured a little bit differently. Right. And of course, every budget is going to look different. So as a parent, it's up to you to decide, you know, if your kid has 7 classes, what are you willing to spend on that to celebrate when they're achieving an A, for example? So I think that that's a really cool way for people to kind of integrate those opportunities for our kids to earn money. And that's been something that my kids have really enjoyed. And, you know, we kind of, it's also something that I use as leverage when they're having a hard time with homework, for example. That's where my kids struggle, is they don't want to do their homework like most kids. That's totally normal.
Yeah, I don't want to do homework either.
But reminding them, hey, you know, this is your job, just like Mom and Dad go to work. This is your job to go to school and to do your work. And at the end of the quarter, you earn money for that, depending on how you perform.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I love that. I love that.